Sophie. I'm a current student on the Master of Medieval Studies program here at St. Hugh's College, Oxford. I did a Bachelor of Arts in History and English Literature at the University of McGill in Montreal, Canada. So I came to Oxford this academic year. My current research focuses on women in medieval Iceland, but I'm expanding my research to looking at Viking Age medicine from next year. But today we're going to be talking about myths, facts, and fiction, reading medieval Iceland through history and literature. So I know that's a really long title, and rightfully people are probably wondering, what on earth does that actually mean, and how is this helpful for me? So let me answer a few questions about the scope of this presentation before we get going. Okay, perfect. Okay, so there are three main things that I think this title really raises. One is the question of interdisciplinarity. So this may not be something that you've come across before. We'll get into a little bit about what that means a bit later in the presentation, but we're going to be looking at both history and literature and how the two work together. Can something be both historical and literary? Should they be both? What do we lose or gain by studying two things at the same time, essentially? And then I'll move on a little bit later in the presentation to talk about why I've made this about the medieval period and why I've chosen to talk to you all about Iceland specifically. Okay, so what is interdisciplinary study or interdisciplinarity? Interdisciplinary study basically means the study of more than one subject field or discipline at any one given time. So if I'm not mistaken, most people here are just starting or doing their A-levels. The way that we're taught in this country at school is very streamlined. We study English literature, we study history, we study religion, all of them are separate subjects. You probably did between 9 and 11 GCSEs, all of which were in a wide range of different subjects separated by very strict boundaries. But what you may have also noticed is that sometimes you find yourself thinking, oh, this thing I learned in chemistry today was very relevant in my biology lesson, or, oh, I think the literary reference in my set text is actually referring to a historical event. What I mean to say is that despite all of our efforts to keep subjects separate from one another, there are a lot of instances where the lines between two or even more subjects become blurry or merge together. This is where we get interdisciplinarity. This is more about the synthesis of two subject fields or more, or the application of one subject field to another in order to read something in a new light. For example, reading the Bible as literature, or studying the history of poetry, or thinking about chemical reactions in the human body, etc., etc. Something merging subject matters allows us to understand something in maybe a more three-dimensional way than the two-dimensional categorization scheme we are taught to believe in throughout our time in school. So this raises a series of important questions. Can something be two things at once? Is it reductive? Does it take away from each individual subject to think about it being more than one thing at a time? And what do we gain from studying history through literature or literature through history? Okay, so how does this link to medieval Iceland, and why have I chosen to talk about this in this context? So let me quickly provide a whistle-stop tour of the history of Iceland, just so that we're all on the same page before I give some examples of how to study things in an interdisciplinary way. So when we talk about medieval Iceland, we're starting in roughly the 10th century, so the 900s, and finishing in about the mid-16th century, so 1550. This obviously spans a huge timescale, and there are so many diversities within this, which is why this presentation will mainly stick to giving a few smaller examples as opposed to talking about the period as a whole. So Iceland was settled predominantly from Norway and the British Isles, with Irish monks being the first people thought to live in Iceland in a seasonal way. This basically meant that they came to pray in Iceland for a period of time before they returned home to Ireland or continued on either a further pilgrimage or their explorative travels. In the year 930, the Althing, or the Icelandic Parliament, created a constitutional law by which the country would be governed as a whole. This fell apart in the 13th century when the Norwegian kings later took over Iceland. But one of the most important things that happens in the history of Iceland is the conversion of the region to Christianity, which took place in the year 1000. This changed the entire belief system, social structure, and cultural exchange of the people both within and outside of Iceland at the time, and will become much more relevant in the later examples given in the presentation. Okay, so the history, literature, and archaeology of Iceland deeply overlaps with that of the Viking Age, which may be something you are more familiar with. So this period affected almost the whole of modern-day Scandinavia and the modern-day Nordic countries. So Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Iceland, Greenland, the Faroe Islands, the British Isles, so Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and England, and even Vinland, which is modern-day North America. The Vikings made it all the way across the Atlantic Ocean. Crucially, this time period does not include Finland, so it's just important to be aware that we're not talking about Finland. Finland was a part of the Kingdom of Sweden and later a part of Russia, so it's important to remember that we're not talking about Finland in the context of the Viking Age. Okay. And in terms of source material, to give you an overview of what sources we are dealing with when we say that we're talking about medieval Iceland in an interdisciplinary way, crucially, the Icelandic sagas. So these are stories that are written in the 13th and 14th century, many of which are attributed to this man here. It's a rather grumpy picture of him, but this is a very famous man in Icelandic history called Snorri Sturluson. He compiled the Norse myths, and is thought to have authored a large number of the sagas. These sagas depict a wide range of topics, things such as international travel, marriages, the conversion of Iceland to Christianity. They have features of both pagan magic and Christian faith, burials, feuds, legal debates, amongst many, many other things. There are so many Icelandic sagas, and they are a huge body of material that are essential to understanding Iceland. But crucially, they are typically categorized or thought about as literature, as a literary source. Okay, to go back here. We then have things such as legal codes. So a code we're going to be talking a lot about in this presentation is the Grágás law or the Grey Goose laws. This was a medieval legal code governing Iceland during the time of the constitution before the takeover of Norway. In terms of archaeological evidence, we're going to be thinking about burials, both human burials and ship burials. The Vikings famously buried their ships. And excavations of these ships and of human remains can give us valuable information about the way that people lived. Also thinking about the excavation of settlement communities and even buildings such as halls, monasteries, and even the land. We then also have international accounts of crucially people coming into contact either with Vikings or traveling to Iceland. So Adam of Bremen and Idun Fadlan document most famously their interactions with the Vikings. So we do have outside perspectives on these cultures as well. Okay, so moving on to my first example. I want to talk to you about a woman called Un the Deep-Minded. She was a prominent and influential woman in the Viking Age. She's also referred to as Ord the Deep-Minded. So we're going to talk about why she goes by two different names, what we know about her, and how we know what we know about her. Okay. So Un was known for her wisdom, hence the name the Deep-Minded, but she's also thought to have had the gift of prophecy or foresight. This is thought of being divinely ordained, and it allows a person to see into the future, to predict dangers, and to be able to warn people about incoming threats to territory or to their own settlement. She appears in Laxdæla saga, which is an Icelandic saga, and also Landnámabók, which is the Book of Icelandic Settlement. It's thought of as a kind of like a very early census, and it's a historical source detailing the lives of people living and settling in Iceland. Okay, so from what we know about Un or Ord, she was a noblewoman who fled Scotland after her family's downfall. She's thought to maybe have been from Norwegian descent, but we don't know this for sure. And she became a very key figure in the early settlement of Iceland. She exercised significant political and economic power, organizing her family's escape, commissioning a ship, and distributing land to her followers in Iceland. So these are all attributes that we probably stereotypically wouldn't think of as being very female or feminine in the context of a medieval settlement. So Un really transgresses the kind of social boundaries of the time, but also transgresses our understanding of the medieval period as historians, a time that's thought about as not being a time period that's particularly allowing of women to come into power or into inheritance in any sort of way. So here are two different descriptions of Un or Ord using both names. So in the literary source, in the Laxdœla saga, Un steered her ship to the Faroe Islands and stayed there for some time. There she married off another daughter of Thorstein named Olof. Un now got ready to go away from the Faroe Islands, made it known to her shipmates that she was going to Iceland. Un had with her many men of great worth and high birth. A man named Kol was one of the worthiest. Amongst her followers, chiefly owing to his descent, he being by title a hersir. The word hersir in Old Norse just means chieftain or like a local guardian. So it's a very high status man to be following a woman in this time period. So what is interesting from the literary source is how much agency the literature affords Un. And this is something that contradicts maybe our understanding of the medieval world, and that women didn't really seem to have a lot of agency from what we would traditionally assume. So what this literature is telling us is, okay, so there's a woman in the 10th century who's able to charter a ship, sail abroad, and settle an entire region. It sounds a bit too good to be true, right? But this is where the history comes in and can be really helpful in modifying and adapting our understanding of what actually took place. So here we have the historical source, the Landnámabók, which is the kind of census. It's a book of settlement, so detailing who is living in Iceland and what is happening at the time of the settlement. So a freedman of Others was called Erðir. Other is the Old Norse word name for Un. So this is where we get the difference between Un and Ord. They are referring to the same person. It's just a translation issue. The Landnámabók continues that Mirigol was the maidservant of Jarl's wife and served her faithfully. She had many skills. She guarded the queen's unborn child while she was taking a bath. Afterwards, Other bought her for a high price and solemnly promised her freedom to her if she served Þuríður, the wife of Thorstein the Red, in the same way in which she had served the queen. Mirgjóð and her son Erðir went to Iceland with Other. So we do actually have a historical account of Un or Ord traveling and settling in Iceland after she purchased a slave, which is also something not attributed to a woman, and that can align with the literature in which she marries off her daughter, which is again typically something the head of the household or the male head of the household specifically would do. So what we see here is both a literary and a historical account attesting to female agency in the medieval Icelandic period. So there is clearly some truth to the saga literature, but equally there are some embellishment. There's not a way to prove everything that happens in the literature, but it is telling that we do have a history to back up the fact that there was a woman named Un who chartered a ship and fled her homeland and settled in Iceland. So when thinking about this through the lens of interdisciplinary study, what we understand is that in certain historical or literary contexts, we cannot possibly have a full picture of the type of settlement going on in Iceland at this time without having both the literary sources and the historical sources. So, in the context of a medieval understanding, having a diverse range of source material can actually be really crucial to understanding what took place. So that's the first example I wanted to talk about, literature versus history. So now we're going to move and do a similar means of analysis, but using two different lenses again. So I'd like to look at the practice of magic, but also the punishment of magic in medieval Iceland. So for this, we're going to be looking at the law. So we're going to take a legal code, or the Graugas laws that I mentioned when talking about the source material, and we're going to compare this to a very, very famous Icelandic poem found in a work called the Poetic Edda, and this poem is called the Völuspá. So just for a little bit of context, the Graugas law, which is this law book you can see a picture of on the left, was the legal code of medieval Iceland during the Commonwealth period, so 930 to 1262, when the Norwegian kings took over. It's a collection of laws, so it's not a single unified document. It covers a really wide range of things, everything from governance and property rights to feuds, and crucially punishments. Great. So, oh yeah, okay. And the Völuspá is, it's a poem. It's one of the most important poems in the Poetic Edda, which was also written by Snorri Sturluson, the man who is attributed to writing a lot of the sagas as well. It presents a prophecy spoken by a seeress to the god Odin, who some of you may be familiar with, and it reveals deep cosmic truths about the origins of the gods, the rise of humanity, and the events of the very famous Ragnarok, or the end of the world. The poem basically creates a syncretism between pagan mythology and Christian faith, making it a really important text for our understanding of Viking Age belief system and the conversion of the Vikings to Christianity. But in this context, what I'm really interested in is the use of magic. This gift of prophecy and foresight that Un was also attributed to having is used again in this poem in a really interesting way. So if we can see here, the areas highlighted in the Graugas, the law code, talking about the punishment of magic. And the punishment for magic in this time period is outlawry. And what outlawry essentially means is that you are removed from having any legal protection in the society of Iceland. So you can be killed without impunity. You are not allowed to vote. You are not allowed to discuss things at the Althing. You cannot marry. So it essentially makes you a social outcast and allows society to take the law into their own hands against you without punishment. It is one of the most severe forms of punishment next to execution. And there are different hierarchies within this. So you'll see in the law code the distinction between lesser and full outlawry. So you can be partially outlawed or fully outlawed. But what is telling is that the use and practice of magic is very much condemned by the Icelandic legal codes at this time period. What this doesn't really give us an indication of, however, is how magic is being practiced, who is practicing magic, why might someone want to practice magic, and why is it so controversial in the legal code of Iceland? Now, that's where we can use the Poetic Edda and the poetic evidence to think about how magic is being used, why it might be being used, and to see an example where it is used. So here are 4 different stanzas from the Poetic Edda. I really like stanza 22. Haith they named her, who sought their home, the wide-seeing witch, in magic wise minds she bewitched, that were moved by her magic. To evil women a joy she was. So it's interesting here that the poem agrees with the legal code that there's a certain evil nature to the use of magic in this time period. However, what isn't referenced in these stanzas is that Odin asks this woman to tell him about the future and the prophecy. So there is a divine demand for the use of magic, and there is also an essential need for magic in this context in order to understand why Ragnarok has happened and how the rise of humanity is going to come about. So again, what we can see is that the law is saying one thing, but the poetry gives an indication of how this magic is anticipated to have been used, the form it comes in. And what we can crucially see is that it is almost impossible to understand the context of magic and the law without both of these two different disciplines working together in a meaningful and powerful way. So if you were a student of just literature, you may not understand the legal context in which magic is so punished and so controversial. And equally, if you were a student of law, looking just at Icelandic law, you may understand that magic is bad, but you may not understand what type of magic is happening, who is practicing the magic, who is asking for the magic to happen. And you therefore see how we do need both disciplines working very closely together to actually form a fully fledged image of what is happening in this time period. Okay, so the kind of final comparison I want to look at is probably the most fun and maybe one in which you will have come into contact with the most. So historical fiction and recreations of the past form an essential part of my field. The question of how we make academic work accessible to people without years of training is a very difficult one to tackle. Popular culture directly influences the ways in which we reflect back on the past, especially if our exposure to popular culture comes before our understanding of the history, which it very often does, because you may not have access to specific types of history unless you pursue either an undergraduate, graduate, or even PhD, depending on what you're studying. So in the context of medieval Iceland or the Viking Age, it's a very popular thing to recreate in popular culture. So we see examples here of things like Game of Thrones, Viking Valhalla, both of which are very, very popular TV shows that use a lot of kind of Old Norse imagery, but also Icelandic saga evidence, but also archaeological evidence to recreate an accessible, fun, like recreation of the past. It's not meant to be accurate, but it does pull on things that are very true and very mentioned in hard evidence in history and in literature as well. So this raises very important questions. Things like, how accurate are these recreations? Are these modern recreations valid ways of understanding the past, or are they also damaging? So I've included on this slide the corner that held them. It's a very lovely book. It's set in a 14th century nunnery in the east of England. It's a historical fiction, so it's a story that is not true, but is based in historic evidence that we have. It's an entire literary genre, and it's a very popular one as well. The equivalent of that would probably be period drama in a TV context. And I have included this image. This is a picture of a Trump supporter at a MAGA rally, and you can see this person is dressed as a Viking and has Viking imagery tattooed on their chest in a kind of way that uses Viking imagery as propaganda of a warrior society. And we can really think about how using these medieval images in a modern political context is both interdisciplinary, but also a potentially damaging way to understand the past, but also an interesting way of using the past and what kind of implications that may have in a modern day society. Okay, so to continue on recreations of the past, sorry, slight jump scare, with this image. So the Old Norse word draugr means undead, and it refers to characters in the Icelandic sagas who die but are not buried and who come back to haunt people, typically their families or the people who have killed them. They are known for causing complete havoc and fear in the Icelandic sagas, and they are also feared among civilians. For the Game of Thrones fans amongst us, they have an uncanny similarity to the White Walkers, and it's speculated that George R. R. Martin used a lot of the saga evidence in the areas to describe north of the Wall, in A Song of Ice and Fire, which is the book Game of Thrones, or the books that Game of Thrones series is based on. So here I've included two descriptions of the Draugr from the Icelandic saga evidence. So on that nest, said Audun, stands a barrow great and strong, wherein was laid Kar, the old, Thorfinn's father. At first father and son had but one farm on the island, but since Kar had died, he was so haunted, this place, that he has swept away all farmers who owned lands here. So that now Thorfinn holds the whole island, but whatsoever man Thorfinn holds his hand over gets no scathe. So that's just a bit of context for how the Draugr come back and they haunt the family members or the areas where they used to live or to exist or where they had traveled. And this section from Eyrbyggja saga discusses a bit more explicitly the appearance of the Draugr. So he was even yet unrotten, and that he was as blue as hell and big as a neat, and when they went about the raising of him, they could in no way stir him. So you get the idea that this is somebody who has died, has not been able to rest because their soul is still active, and they come back kind of as these terrifying, half alive, half dead people. They are very explicitly not ghosts, they are undead. So they kind of occupy this space in between the living and the dead. And most importantly, they haven't been allowed to rest for some reason. So you can see how these descriptions of the Draugr have influenced modern literature, but also the way that people animate and create these like supernatural characters in TV shows, and you can see the parallels there between the Draugr in the descriptions in Grettis and Eyrbyggja saga, and the picture here of the White Walker, and there is another White Walker here for the people who know Game of Thrones. And another example of this that I wanted to talk about is a Viking ship excavation versus the Viking ship museum. So again, using different pools of evidence. So this first picture here is the excavation of the Oseberg ship burial in 1904. It is one of the most famous ship excavation sites in all of like Viking Age history. And it's a burial in Norway. And the picture I've put adjacent to it is from the Viking Ship Museum in Oslo. It's a museum I'd highly recommend going to if you ever find yourself in Oslo. But they are currently renovating it, and this is the proposed placing of the Viking ship. At the moment, it is just placed in a big hall as you enter the museum. But this is a prospective recreation of the ship for the 2027 launch of the Viking Ship Museum. As you can see, it is kept with a projection of the waves over the top to kind of mimic the Viking experience in which it would be used. It is also underneath a giant dome. So typically when ships are buried, they're buried in what is called burial mounds, which are very specific to the Viking Age. Not exclusively in an Icelandic context. There are actually no ships that have been excavated in Iceland itself. This is a much broader Viking Age period thing, but it does make us think about how useful it is to be able to reconstruct these ships and create immersive experiences for modern day audiences to receive this archaeological evidence. So what we can see from all of these different examples is that if we alienate one subject from another, we typically are not able to draw a conclusive or a broad image of what it is like to live in this time period. So in the context of the practice of magic in a legal versus a poetic sense, it was very difficult for us to be able to understand what type of magic was being practiced, what magic looked like, without the literary and creative embellishments from the literary side of it, but also how severe the punishment could be from a legal, more historical and objective side as opposed to the creative presentation of magic. When we looked at Un and Ord the Deep-Minded, again, if you just have exposure to the literature, you see the depiction of a woman chartering a ship, being followed by men, and settling entire community. It's very difficult to know how much of this is a literary or creative embellishment. And in the context of the misogyny that is so present in the medieval period, you would be forgiven for thinking that this was a completely fabricated story. But then the essential historical information can actually back up certain areas of the literature, and you can start to understand and to recreate an image in which women are able to actually charter ships, flee their home countries, and have essential input into the settlement of a new region, which is perhaps very striking and has been very crucial to disproving the theory that women were unanimously oppressed in the medieval period. And that's a field that I'm currently working on, is very interesting to me and has been so rewarding to marry that literary and historical evidence together. So, coming to a few final conclusions. Why does interdisciplinarity matter? And why is it important to be aware of studying in this way before arriving at university? So, this deeply matters. The ability to cross subject borders and think about things outside of the discipline that they are in is essential to our understanding of the past. We're living in a time where things are labeled, broken down into subjects or subsets, more so than ever before in history. And this is extremely valuable. It's led to greater understanding and allows people to express themselves more specifically in ways that we haven't been able to do throughout history. However, there is a certain irony in that in order to see the world and understand the world through the eyes of the people who lived it at the time, we need to be able to think like them, to reconstruct a past that was the present to the people we are trying to study. And for this, we need to transgress the boundaries that modern day subject labels have placed on things. So I really hope that through these few examples, I have been able to show you how literature can interact with history, can interact with archaeology, to demonstrate that the marrying together of different subject matters can lead to broader, more creative, and arguably more accurate recreations of the past. When thinking about the medieval period specifically, and if any of you go on to study the medieval period specifically, not just in an Icelandic or in a Northern European context, but in a global context, what you will find is that there are so many areas in which we just don't have access to a large number of source materials, either because they have been lost to history, because they have been destroyed, or because they have been deliberately modified or tampered with. And therefore, we have to be a little bit more creative in the way that we approach history or literature or whatever the discipline is that you are looking at. So interdisciplinarity is a modern day concept. It's a modern day subject matter. The idea of pulling different strands of history and marrying them with literature, marrying them with linguistics, anthropology, whatever the three disciplines are, is a modern concept, but it has very medieval roots in the sense that the medieval time period was interdisciplinary. Snorri Sturluson was not intentionally creating this to be an entirely false fabrication literature that was supposed to be read for fun. The sagas have a deep oral tradition. That means they were passed down from generation to generation through speech, from mother to child, or said around campfires. And it was inevitably the passing of oral tradition that allowed the sagas to be written down by Snorri in the 13th or 14th century. So these sources have deep and rich cultural histories within themselves, and therefore alienating any one given section of the source is actually, in some ways, disrespecting the way in which it was created and limiting our understanding both of the source itself and of the source's ability to educate us on a literary source educating us on a history, or a history source educating us on literary tradition. So I really hope I've been able to show you that the interaction between different source materials can lead to broader, more creative, and arguably more accurate, I would argue more accurate, recreations of the past.